You're going to move.
Much as I like to listen.
More or less, we can start, if you don't mind. Yeah. Thank you first for having me. I'm very privileged to be leading this discussion, and I'm really hopeful, very excited for what's going to come out from it. It seems like a good opportunity for the paper givers to, collaborate, bring together things that we've been hearing, but as well, all of us who have been listening. It seems a good chance for us to be readers of the word and not hearers only. Thank you very much. I thought I would start just with a prayer from Psalm 84. Blessed are the men whose strength is in thee, in whose heart are the pilgrim ways, who, going through the vale of misery, use it for a well. Yea, the early rain covereth it with blessings. They go from strength to strength, and unto the God of gods appeareth every one of them in Zion. Before we get to the actual text we'll look at, I wanted to say a bit about the background thinking of this, which has its root in Dante, who I think of all people is the quintessential pilgrim, and therefore has a lot to say to us about hope. A lot of what this conference, I think, has been drawing out has been the importance of hope to our status as pilgrims, the status viatoris, as opposed to the completion of the journey. And Dante, there's so many indications in the comedy that hope is deeply important for him and central, really, to the whole movement. Thinking of, where I was thinking is in Paradiso 25, he encounters St. James. Now, this is in the context of a catechesis on faith, hope, and love, on all three theological virtues. And the people who ask him questions there in Paradiso are St. Peter on faith, St. James on hope, and St. John on love. It's looking at his conversation with St. James, and he says to St. James, the reasons for hope in me were, he's very specific, I found hope first in the Psalms of David and in your epistle. I think some commentators have seen this as just flattery of St. James. That doesn't seem really an adequate account. But it does make me want to say, why? Why St. James? Why would he be the locus for Dante's for the birth and the strengthening of Dante's hope. In order to address that question, we'll look at the Epistle of St. James and at a few Psalms. But before we do that, I just want to dig in a little bit deeper into how he's questioned by St. James and what his answers are, or who answers them, in fact. So James asks him, what is hope? What made it blossom in you? And he, the one who answers for him the second question is Beatrice. She says actually there's no one more rich in hope in the church militant than this man. Again, you might think, well, maybe this is just Dante preserving himself from boasting by having Beatrice say this for him. But actually, I think in the commentaries there is, this has been noted, there's a reference back to what happened at the top of the earthly paradise when Dante first encountered Beatrice. She was his beloved. She was dressed in the colors of the theological virtues, and she was attended by the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues, or angels representing them. And so she's dressed in red. Her mantle is green, and she has a white veil on. So red for charity, green for hope, and white for faith. And I think the further detail about Beatrice that's, I think, quite lovely is that her eyes themselves are green, which I think says a lot about, just in one small image of her role in Dante's cause for hope and the birth of hope in him. But anyway, in the top of earthly paradise, when she appears and he turns to speak to Virgil, and he's not there anymore, and he begins to weep, and she says, don't you know this is the place where man has joy? And then the angels sort of step in sympathy for him, in pity, and they begin to sing a psalm. Make sure I get the psalm right. Psalm 31, which I think is one of the ones I had printed here. So, in thee, O Lord, have I put my trust. That one. But they stop singing when they get to the line, thou hast not shut me up into the hand of the enemy, but hast set my feet in a broad place. And they don't go beyond that. And you can see the next line is, have mercy upon me, O Lord. And she says to them, no, you can't say that to him right now. Because you see things from the perspective of eternity. But I know what this man needs. I will speak with him with greater care, and so that his sin and his sorrow will match. And then there's the whole discussion they have about his choosing other goods after her death. And I won't go into that too much, but she basically is leading him to repentance. And I think it's a very interesting moment, because there she's refusing him hope in a certain way. She's saying, no, wait, hold on a minute. And I've wondered if that's a kind of preserving him from presumption at that point. But then in 25, Canto 25 of Paradiso, she herself stands in and says, no, there is no one more rich in hope than he. But this moment of repentance has had to come in between. So I think that answer in itself is very interesting, that, who he has answer that question of whether he has hope. Yep. So then that's a sort of that one answer. The second answer he answers about, it was the Psalms and it was the Epistle of James that brought hope to birth in me. The Epistle of James, images from it are all throughout that canto of the good kind of raining down. And they're also there in Canto 30 in Purgatorio, just after that moment I mentioned. And we look in the Convivio and in Monarchia, he also uses James a lot. These images of the early and the late rain, they matter a lot to him. So all that to say that there's reasons within the narrative of the poem for understanding, for helping us see how James might be an emblem of hope for Dante. But I would like to really turn to the epistle itself and look at those passages. It seems as though there's reasons in the lectionary as well to see James as emblematic of hope, though it might not be our first thought. But yes, what I'd like to ask, I guess, in my opening question would be why the Psalms, why James, apart from the narrative questions of the comedy, but in themselves, the Psalms and James, how do they speak of us of hope? And should we be asked these questions of James? How might they bring hope to blossom in us? From there, we have Father Kraus's paper, which, in a way, what I'd like looking at James and the Psalms to do is, in a way, acting out what he's invited us to do, which is to attend to God's word, and also to hold faith, hope, and love together as we consider hope, and sort of remember the unity of the virtues. But he does give us some really helpful ways of relating those three virtues throughout the course of that paper, and maybe we can talk a bit more about that and about the hope's particular relation to prayer. So that's about as much as I'll say, I guess. And if anyone has any opening thoughts about why James or why the Psalms?
James is, I'll say something. James is, from our perspective, an odd choice. On the one hand, I think biblical scholars tell us that the term Christ barely appears in the epistle. That seems to be, from a modern perspective, that's a striking wisdom. And of course, from the post-Reformation perspective, Martin Luther didn't have much use for the Epistle of Straw, because the emphasis, what Luther saw is the emphasis on works. But I think therein might be, just thinking out loud, a bit of a clue as to why it is important. Because this is emphasis on doing things, even in spite of, or in the face of, discouragements and things not going that well. So this is St. James constitutes an exhortation to good works in the midst of a lot of discouragement. And one would only do that if one was possessed of the virtue of hope.
It's also just a very practical, down-to-earth epistle. You don't have to be a scholar to understand it. You don't have to know the scriptures thoroughly. You don't have to be a theologian. You just have to read it and follow its very practical recommendations of do good things. So I can see how it would bring hope to someone who doesn't necessarily have that.
It's an epistle of perseverance.
Sorry, what was that?
Perseverance.
Well, there was one, a couple verses here that really struck me as I was thinking about hope in it. And it's this great image of seeing yourself in a mirror. I'm afraid it did remind me of Plato's cave, but you know, the passing images. I'll just read 2 verses if that's okay. For if any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself, and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. So, in the sense of hearing, you hear it in the immediacy of hearing it. There's something substantial to it, but that then without the works, that's a passing moment. And so I guess there is something, sort of about the cultivation and development of faith as a matter and of hope as a matter of tying down what is heard and what is done, like life and thought, so that it becomes real. And only when it's real can you have something to hope for, something concrete to hope for. And so I guess that's I wonder if that's the one way that works. The place of works can be hopeful.
Well, if you go back a couple lines, can you read 17 for me?
17, yes. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning.
That's the beginning of the Dionysian corpus, right? That's the beginning of the celestial hierarchy. And, you know, he's making his way already through the celestial hierarchy in the Paradiso. And of course, it's Bonaventure's most cited piece of scripture. Dante is a Franciscan, or third order Franciscan. There can be some links there too.
I always find, just on that verse 123 that you quoted a moment ago, that the phrase that's translated as natural face in Greek is prosopontes geneseos. It's the face of his coming to be. Right, it's the face he has as he springs forth from his arche.
Sorry, Walter, can you say again?
Sorry, it's the face of his coming to be. Genesis, right, is the word, the Greek word. So it's the face that you have as you emerge from your principle.
I'm sorry, what was this related to? What was the reference?
Oh, it's James 1:23, which he just quoted.
And what would be the principle?
Presumably the Trinity.
Now you're making the book theological.
The pairing of, so people's comments about James as a practical book, I think is helping me maybe understand why the Psalms are also included, because they're less about practical action and more about state of mind or feeling. And they both share with James, I think Father Hutt's comment brought this out, James, tribulation, like there's something difficult going on, there's something painful in process. But in the Psalms, the turn is not so much towards practical action, but towards sort of an appeal to God. So they pair in an interesting way.
Yeah, what I find with the way Dante used that psalm where he says, they stop singing at "Thou hast set my feet in a broad place," which is sort of like "Thou hast established me, I'm good" kind of thing, is that the next line is "Have mercy on me," and the Psalms have that way of turning from one. They never allow you to kind of rest. You know, they have they change modes even within Psalms, and in a way that reflects our state, I think. And what I would argue is there's a way in which James does that too. reading him, I found my heart was kind of seared all the time. Like he's really doesn't give you a lot of leeway, right? He gives you something, a deeply encouraging or wonderful comment, and then he follows it up by, but don't do this. You know, it's this pattern within his epistle. James the righteous, you know, he's really, well, it reminds me of how Father Crow says in the paper, you know, hope is no Pollyanna. This is that, I love that term, virile adhesion. Yeah, and it's not just about the steadfastness and that James exhorts us to see very much of that quality. And it was striking, the passage you both were speaking to, for the lectionary, for the old lectionary, when do we read James? We read him Easter 4 and Easter 5. And Easter 5 is Rogation Sunday, the Sunday of prayer. And the other time we read James is Ash Wednesday. So it seems like there's a lovely way in which that demonstrates, I think, this sort of quality of James as speaking to both hope and repentance at, you know, in one breath and then the next.
Just looking back, thinking about the question that came up earlier, the paper, the question was the now but not yet, and this in-between time, which I think the psalm is in a way addressing. But in James, it's in chapter 5, when James asks the question, is any among you afflicted? Amen. And just wonderful responses from James. What to do in the body of the faithful.
Yeah.
Is there any sense of knowing when it was that Dante in his life encountered James? Are there any other hints as to what might have been the circumstance?
Not that I know of, though I do think that James writing to the church in exile might have been very important for him.
Okay, yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
I've always found that moment interesting, and just to think of that, the sort of questions around that James asks him, that in a way he's recalling this. How were you led to hope? Well, these are the texts I read. But in a way we know that's been a failure, right? Like this is like that happened before the beginning of the poem. So in a way that has been a failure, and that it's actually the poem that restores those things to him. I wonder if that changes it at all. I don't know, but that's always seemed to be, because it's sort of a hilarious scene, and it's like he's a good catechumen and he's sort of answering these questions. But in a way it's like, no, you failed. You failed those questions. Like you learned them, but you didn't know them. Like otherwise we wouldn't be here right now.
That's an interesting point.
I don't know if that changes a thing, but it is curious. I've always thought that strange or striking.
Well, that raises all sorts of questions as to what you do with the timeline in the comedy overall.
In which
The timeline within the Divine Comedy overall.
Yeah.
But what do you make of it? I mean, at what point do you say, you know, this is where we are now?
Also, within the poem, it seems to be Virgil that brings hope to him, because he's lost, and he can sort of get a little bit out of the wood himself, but then he's confronted by the beast, and he kind of just gives up. And somebody come and help me, and Virgil appears, and then he doesn't mention Virgil at all up in Paradiso, you know, having granted him hope. But if we read sort of the poem literally, or at least it does seem to be Virgil was at least the pagan poet that gave him hope.
Though he was sent by Mary, Lucy, and Beatrice. Yeah. Well, there is one further question that James asks him. He says, I would like to hear you say, so he says this thing about, it was your epistle and it was the Psalms, and he flashes approval, and then he says, I would like to hear you say what promise hope holds out to you, which maybe could be seen as okay, so that was then, and now, how about now? I don't know if that's, and then it's after that answer that he gives to that the angels sing Speret and Te, another song of hope. I don't know if there's something there.
I guess we can wonder, this is related to the question of the timeline. When did he become so rich in hope? Was this before, or has he been making his way through? And now that he's a member of the church militant and not a member of the church suffering, and has made it through that purgatory, has that rendered him the most rich in hope among the members of the church militant? Because he happens to have been displaced from the rest of the church militant and has been hanging out with, I guess, the church of the Inferno and this sort of kind, and then the church suffering has come through it.
There's something just very jarring in the very idea that the same person who wrote "The Man in Hope, All Ye Who Enter Here" declares himself to be the most rich in hope of the whole church militant. Can we reconcile this?
I guess it's a question of what is it that renders one hopeful? And I think this goes back to Aiden's paper from earlier today. What makes one not hopeful? What's the real change in disposition?
Well, I think that the Epistle of James is one of the most poignant treatments of the dangers of self-dishonesty.
Oh, yeah.
Self-dishonesty, as opposed to self-honesty, which is why I think those passages that have a place they have in the later literature you're referring to there. And apropos to your comment about seeming contradiction, the whole point of the descent into hell is to understand how the soul can be ruined. And Dante does not belong in hell, but he must understand it.
So Dante does not do it?
He doesn't belong in hell, but he must understand the degrees of depravity of soul. That's why it's the first canticle. So understanding the loss of hope in the relation to the profound, so the beginning, self-knowledge is the beginning of the term, that is the basis of hope. I think that's why.
Yeah, it's striking how much James says, do not be deceived, do not be deceived.
I mean, that mirror image, like,
Yeah.
you see yourself and you don't even, like, talk about memory, because you don't even remember what you saw. Memory is the ground of self-knowledge, is the ground of conversion.
Yeah, though what's interesting about that passage, I don't know quite what to make of this, but the verb that he uses to say, but he who looks into the perfect law of liberty, is, I can't remember the Greek right now, but it looks into the same verb that they use when they look into the tomb. It's a kind of a glance. It's like he who just glances at this law and goes and does it. There's no hesitation, no diffidence, exactly. He is the one whose works will be blessed. I thought that was quite striking, not what I was expecting. So I thought, look into it'll be, who examines the law and who really studies it, comes to a very deep understanding of it. But no, and it seems like this goes along with self-deception. This law is simple, and he talks about the law of liberty as being, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You know, that's what it comes down to. Like, just do that. It's going to serving, visiting widows and orphans in their affliction. You know, it's simple.
Exactly what everybody else down in the inferno hasn't been doing.
Yeah.
Have you loved your neighbor of yourself? Oh, definitely not.
So the self-deception, but then also this self-consciousness, I think James is sort of counseling us against as well. You know, which is, I think, part of what maybe is involved in hesitation. Yeah. And he says, like, let not many of you become teachers. Like, don't, and then has that discussion of the problems with the tongue and with speaking. Yeah, it's quite powerful about that, I think.
There's also the passage, verses 5 to 6 in book 1 of James. Yes, you have had a magnificent time on this earth, and have indulged yourselves to the full. You have picked out just what you wanted, like soldiers looting after battle. You have condemned and ruined innocent men in your career, and they have been powerless to stop you. In the previous sense, but the Lord of hosts himself.
Yeah.
That's like, it's a fair number of passages in the Inferno. Yep.
What do people think, just to go back to the images a little bit, in James there's a lot of agricultural images of the early and the late rain coming down, which I'm still very curious about that. But of waiting, for the farmer waits, and then the word being engrafted, implanted in us. It's all over the place, and then Dante certainly picks up on that imagery to really govern, I think, in a lot of ways, the imagery of Paradiso. Yeah, what do people think of that image? And thinking too also of how hope is. I guess I would want to say hope for James is very green, and it, you know, as it comes to be related to in the tradition as the color of hope. But yeah, and if there's anything in the Psalms that might pick up on that, or
well, anyone who gardens knows the importance of hope. I was contemplating tilling my garden under this year because the crop wasn't so prosperous last year. But it has to be in hope that I've built some raised beds and plant them when I return from this conference. So the very practice of gardening is one that presupposes hope. I mean, you wouldn't do it unless you were hopefully, you know, all this work was hopefully going to produce something. And but the means whereby it produces something is also not completely under your control. At best, you cooperate with nature, or you know, our progress in the life of grace is, you know, with and cooperating with, you know, prevenient grace and cooperating. We do grace, we don't do it all ourselves. And so all images of gardening or planting, you know, assume you have to have hope. Hope is there, you wouldn't do it in the first place. And the very process is one that perpetuates hope and is based on hope and is sustained by hope. So that could be some thoughts there.
what if we put that agricultural image in thinking about the rain together with his comment about every good and perfect gift cometh from down from above, which is something he says a couple of times, the wisdom that is from above, every good and perfect gift.
Well, it doesn't rain, it doesn't bog and sprout, it doesn't germinate, it doesn't continue to rain, and you get rain at the right time, it dominates what it does. You know, there's a need for the grace of rain to begin it, and there's a need of the grace of rain to perpetuate it, to sustain it. So we want to prevenient grace and so on.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of this, so I had to deal with something that was very unhelpful at work.
Well, I was just saying that,
As opposed to, well,
well, I think that, actually what I didn't say is there is a tradition that was, I think, coming just into play, I believe, when he was, like it's a later thing, but of associating the three apostles, Peter, James, and John, with the virtues of faith, hope, and charity. So there's that in the background. But I was trying to argue that Dante is not just coming into that tradition and picking it up, like without thinking through it. He seems to have known the Book of James very well.
okay, I heard that part.
Yeah. Passages with reference to hope.
So, really for Peter and others of you who are scholars, is what we heard today about the scholastic debate about hope, in particular the teachings of the Book of James, to the
Well,
do you see a connection?
not that I've seen, but I have been looking for it.
Okay.
So, there's a to keep an eye on what might pop out if you're not looking for it, especially something of that sort. What shows up as an argument or a response to an argument, and to see if, does James pop out somewhere. So that might be something worth digging for. Now, go home and dig.
Right.
So that's worth thinking about.
But even without James, is the activity of doing, as opposed to believing?
Oh yes, doing.
Is the activity of doing connected psychologically to hope in a way that isn't true for the
Yes.
other theologians?
I mean, that's what we,
That's
when we went into the discussion of diffidence and hesitation. And so there, you've got this idea in someone like a Bonaventure, or even in an Albert, really emphasizing the irascible just for that point, saying, hope gets stuff done, because it moves the other virtues. It moves the other virtues to get going. And to persist, this idea of persistence, to persist in continuing to do the good. It's the anchor and the support in that way. And I guess we've seen anything in Dante throughout the Paradiso, throughout the comment, he keeps going. Right? If he didn't have that, he would have turned away a long time ago. Right? Is that perpetual forward motion, the perpetual development that hope seems to sustain.
I think there's also something inherently hopeful about acting in the world in the sense that none of us can totally by ourselves see our actions through to fruition. Like we can try, but the cosmos is not under our control, so we have to some degree trust in others that what we do will bring about some sort of good outcome, a good fruit for others. And it's rather different from if you just sit there and speculate in your mind and construct this perfect world and this intellectual system in your mind. You can totally see it through to perfection. You can make it all perfect, but it doesn't actually have any impact on the world until you act in hope and say, well, I'm going to try to bring about a better world. I can't get it all the way there. I have to trust in others and trust in God. They all seem like efforts to do it, and I think that's where hope comes in.
Maybe that's where Dante's exile is exactly, sort of the proof of his hope. That he persists even through exile. It's the Romans 5 tribulation that produces hope, or something of that sort.
I'm wondering, maybe this is related, like just what it means to have more or less hope. Like we sort of been speaking about it as having it or not, but Dante is referred to as the one who, most of all of the others, right? So it's like, hierarchy of hope quantities. What does that mean to have more or less hope? Yeah, like, is it how much hope? Yeah. And I don't know whether it is as I forget who was saying this. It's sort of a gradual increase as the itinerary continues, or is it the descent and then the gradual increase? Like the point, but this goes with the question of how it begins, as James is asking, how has it come to blossom? Blossom, of course, has the idea that it
Yeah.
was there before.
Yeah.
But then blossom,
Mhm.
like, so I guess, yeah, I'm trying to see it as, or like ask how it's related to the itinerary, and how, like what's that look like? Can that be, is that something we can put into words, or like this kind
I
of
think
more or less?
if you're going to go with scales of hope, I think if we're going to go about this like a medieval theologian would, you've got a couple options on the table. You've got the speed of response to a proposed good that might be difficult. Like, how quickly are you not going to be diffident? Like, what's your diffidence rate? Right? That's one. Then another one is sort of, to what goods are you oriented? Like, how many goods are you seeing in that ultimate good that contains? So, like, how expansive is the hope? And then I think the third would be how virile is your adhesion? Not just how quickly do you act, but how strongly do you intend, and to what extent are you nearly immovable? Not yet immovable because you're not in patria, but how nearly immovable are you from this end? So I think that's the three different scales that I can come up with for our hopometer.
Can you just repeat the second one?
The second one of the hopometer is the expansiveness of the hope.
Okay.
So, is your hope for I want to be saved, or is your hope richer in its content than that? Yeah.
Like sanctified grace. It's a similar question.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Pretension. Particularly answer. So I install just like parents of young children know that especially. But but looking back, Beecher's looking back upon what Dante has done, what he has lived, can say that he has had always this great, he's a great son of the church and a great son of hope, because he has manifested it in the daily grind of living through the faith and living out the faith. So it's something that you can see and sort of evaluate retrospectively. And that's what she's doing, looking back over his life. So he's manifested it, but it's only in retrospect. Just like patience, you're going to be patient tomorrow, you don't know. You might be patient today, but over an incident that happened yesterday, you can perhaps, you even yourself or someone else can say, yes, you were patient in that situation. And perhaps it's a similar sort of retrospect with respect to hope. And so then we don't have to get into the business of actually quantifying it.
Are we sure James's questions aren't antagonistic? Is there another Lexio we could have here? What is hope, Dante? How has it come to blossom in your mind? Whence did it come to you? Ever?
It's an interrogation.
Right, is this an interrogation? Right. So, is it an entirely beneficent approach, or is it, salvifically derisive?
I love that term.
How does that work? Salvifically derisive.
Well,
Derisive for the purposes of your
Like chastising.
chastising him. Yeah, that's right,
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
right, yeah.
Just burns a little. It's just purgatorial burn.
Yep. The first time in that.
What's just another way of, what might be the relation of the hope to the despair in the face of which this hope is felt? confront your despair, go through it, and then to have a firmer, clearer, don't know whatever it is, sort of vision of the truth.
Do you think, Will, there's another way of asking that question? I've never thought of this before, but could we even say that his hope actually remains consistent for the whole poem? Like, is his hope greater at the end than the beginning?
Doesn't that change a bit? I mean, in preparation for this conference, I reread first Purgatory. There's moments when he buckles in fear, right? Where the pilgrim just absolutely trembles at this spook or whatever it is. So that is to say, his state isn't constant, even if his path is, there's a constancy to the path that he takes. But his emotional state or his disposition isn't always.
Oh no, his disposition is changing endlessly. I was just wondering, I was thinking, so in the scene with Jane, and he is able to articulate hope. And in a way at the bottom, before he's completely inarticulate before he enters into the inferno, he's totally inarticulate. But there's a remarkable kind of hope there, right?
I think that,
And in fact, in some way, it might even be a greater hope, right? Because he's in the Paradiso, it's like all the wheels are turning.
Yeah.
He's he's been through the purifying fire. Like, there's a way that he's like, barp, barp, and it's like cruising toward home, right? And it's a very different story than earlier.
I mean, I think like, I was just struck by that question that Luke asked earlier, is he now he's the most hopeful person in church movement? I mean, if you've been following along, if you're a reader of the Divine Comedy, you know how much that's true, that he needed a pagan poet to get him out of the forest. I mean, but that's the same person who is the most hopeful in the church militant is itself, sorry, I'm not trying to be cute, extremely hopeful.
Yeah, for the rest of us.
Because there's a way, isn't it true? Don't we all know this? There's a way in which the virtues lie hidden in us, even though they're clearly not manifesting in our lives right now. Right? That there's a way in which our path to spiritual growth is a path of coming to become more ourselves as God creatures. And that often our state of hopelessness and of sin and powerlessness is that we simply do not know ourselves, both in our depravity and in our virtue. So I think self-knowledge is one of the keys to the whole poem, and I think that so it can be both true of him that he is the most hopeful person, and be the same Dante who is the Dante in the forest who cannot get anywhere. And it's also a question of how we are seen, right? It's not just a question of how we see ourselves. That's why it's so crucial that it's vital that he is seen. Beatrice, who knows him in the forest at the beginning, because she's ultimately the one who sends, right? So it's how we are known as well as how we know ourselves. And of course, we rely on being known so that we can know ourselves. That's the essence of grace. Right?
Well, it's interesting to imagine what Dante's answer would have been if Beatrice hadn't, got in for him. Like, he's the most hopeful, trust me. We'd be like, I don't know.
I've had my moments.
It's hope. Well, right.
I mean, you know what I mean, though, right? We need just to bring this down to we need one another to know each other's virtues, because we often don't know them, right? Our virtues are not exercised in solitude, they're exercised in community. And we often need other people to help see ourselves. And I think that's beautifully brought out in her saying of him something that, yeah.
But he probably wasn't playing for himself, right?
Right?
Yeah.
And I was struck by reading that essay, that paper by Father Krauss. He says in no uncertain terms, despair is what's his phrase? The greatest sin. Is it something? It's quite strong to put, right?
Despair is the
Greatest sin.
yeah.
It's something like that, right?
He also says our despair is all our own. This is almost the very end. Our Christian hope is surely established in the promises of God. Our despair is all our own, and of our own making.
Right.
And then the line is,
But
hope is no Pollyanna.
I mean, to me, that's precisely why the antidote to despair also involves community.
Which is part of Father Krauss's argument too, with the church. But also in this paper, Father Krauss is opposing despair to hope.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what would Dante have done in the wood if he simply despaired?
You stayed there.
Is that negative enough?
Is it negative enough?
Because his hope took him all the way to heaven, through hell and purgatory. So to say he simply stayed there, is that sufficiently the negation of what he did do through his hope, or it did accomplish by grace and through hope?
That seems to, I guess, ask the question maybe of the relation of desire to hope, and whether they're coextensive on the journey. Because if they are coextensive, then I guess staying there is what he would end up doing, because he wouldn't have desire to do anything, good or bad.
Would have found himself among the indecisive on the outside of hell, right?
In the vestibule.
Well, but I see that. I mean,
But we don't live in an age which thinks that the indecisive is the worst thing possible. We certainly don't live in an age of that. Political neutrality would seem to be a great bonus. Or, don't take side in an issue. Be open-minded. Stay neutral. So we live in an age that doesn't think inaction is the most terrible of things.
Well, I think this is an important point to bring out, which the other side of not despair but presumption, that it's okay not to act, or not to in one's daily life, like all the little decisions, but also I think we feel that temptation to despair, that's very palpable to us. But actually I wonder, I'm thinking about diffidence and hesitation, and makes me think a little, and what Father Krauss is pointing out about attention as being the kind of attentiveness to the word, as being the kind of antidote to our weakening of hope and faith. Well, all three. Is how much we are distracted, right? And in that distraction, is there a kind of presumption? Like, is in all of our capacity for distraction, our inattention, which is it's something we struggle with so much. Are we as actually?
Can you say more about why you ask it, why does presumption come to your mind?
Well, I guess to be like kind of full disclosure, just thinking of a kind of Thomistic framework or where presumption lies on the other side. So thinking of hope as a virtue, and there's presumption, and there's despair, and these two things are, you know, both. But presumption is a false hope, and despair is no hope, I guess. So yeah, I am thinking a little bit of that framework and wondering if, which has made me wonder, oh yeah, you know, maybe presumption is something we need to be, you know, cautious of in our lives as well. Even though in the discussion of hope, of course, and you know, the question of despair is more the one that comes to the forefront. You know.
There's not an aspect, and I also learned about this, but the torment of being lived there was to suffer harm through living in desire. Now, that suggests quite a powerful tension there. And others would comment on that point about the torment of being lived there, which is, of course, a phase suffered by Abraham in other respects. It's like a paradigm we think of hope and certainty through having not the point of being able to sacrifice either. He ends up in this condition.
But isn't he rescued by Christ?
Right, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think about the state in the complex. It means that desire is part of that torment involved in living.
Yeah, the worm of conscience associated with synderesis. That there's a natural desire for the good that, yet won't come to its fruition. So there's kind of a scary other version of hope that's not despair or presumption. But
When I think presumption, it seems just the way we've described it to be. Related to what Amy was talking about earlier, which is cynicism, which is that the circuit closes, right? That we've seen through all the possibilities, and those two seem to lie right next to each other.
Which two, Alan?
Presumption and cynicism. The way Aidan spoke about it this morning was cynicism.
So cynicism and presumption, or
Yeah.
cynicism and despair?
Presumption.
Presumption.
Yeah. Also despair. I mean, he was speaking of it this morning as a species of despair.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I think just the way we're speaking of presumption here, you can see it also as a species of presumption.
Yes, yes. And there's a common little phrase that's used in our society quite frequently, and I encounter as a Christian over the years, and I realize that it's morphed in its meaning, and the phrase is, "It is what it is." Now, I used to take that 20 years ago as sort of an incline to fatalism, but now I think it's something different. It's this absolute, you know, cynicism. You know, it is that way, and it just, so I think there's been a morphing from a fatalism towards aspects of a profound cynicism when people say that to me. And, you know, they often say it in connection with, you know, some loved one's illness or something like that. And well, it is what it is. And, you know, just shrug and off they go. And, you know, and of course there's also aspects of despair too. I mean, it's something, it's the sort of phrase I don't know I heard 40 years ago when I began the ministry. I don't know if people would say it. And then it came into vogue sort of as, it seemed to have fatalistic overtones, and now I know for sure it's morphed into something a bit different. But it shows how, you know, the popular consciousness is aware of these things, and these are the living questions, also very deadly questions.
Well, I guess that statement really, I think, reveals, I think we have a tendency to sort of limit our perspective or to be stuck in it. I think especially with Father Hannah Stern, I think kind of touched on this the other night. back of my mind, but it's so hard to see from a heavenly perspective. And that's, I think that's what makes despair so possible.
Just to turn to Father Krause for a moment, because one thing that struck me about the sort of antidote, if I can put it that way, that he's offering, or the encouragement he's offering, seemed to me to be, he was points to Augustine, to the Enchiridion, and also to Bonaventure, and as well as others, for various definitions of hope or ways of thinking about hope in relation to the other virtues. And there is in that contemplation of the virtues, I think, a lot of good for us, because it's just a worthy thing to, I think the thinking of them in itself is worthy. But he also is saying, in Augustine's Enchiridion, it's the creed and it's the Lord's Prayer. It's like the really like ground essentials. And you find faith, hope, and love in those things. And those things are kind of, they act on us, like still trying to understand how one prays the creed exactly, but I think there is a way in which one does. I just find a lot of encouragement in that the bare, we can call them the bare essentials, have that fullness there for us. So that, yeah, just think that was interesting how he brings that out through how Augustine's little handbook, which is, but then also I think Bonaventure also talks about hope in relation to the Lord's Prayer. And the particular element
Genesis of this paper comes out of the Essentials movement, which was a moment in Anglicanism in Canada to try to resist the tides of, I guess, progressivism, perhaps, or liberalism. I'm not quite sure how it was defined in Canada, but bringing together Anglican evangelicals, Perfect Society folks, Anglo-Catholics, Charismatic Renewal, to find some way to hold ground themselves or resist whatever was coming. Can I just say that reading this paper was my first encounter with Dr. Krause in the U.S.
What was that?
This is my first encounter with Dr. Krause, reading this paper. It's a long story, I won't get into all of it, but I was serving in an Episcopal church in the early 2000s, at a time when things were very fraught in the Episcopal church, and we were all looking for Anglican resourcement, tools of some kind, resources of any kind. And most of them were very much, I would say, very presumptuous. Very sort of warfare language, winners, losers, win the day sort of language. And I remember reading this probably in 2000. I found it online. And I found something much deeper, richer here. It was not about that at all. Just this one line he has in the very opening paragraph. It's particularly important now that we should not fail in hope if we remain steadfast. All our troubles and confusions will, in God's good providence, be a blessing to us, because it'll be more the means of refining and purifying our faith and hope and charity. There was an opportunity there, I think, to accept troubles as a purification versus a sort of presumption of victory, which was very much in the air in those days. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Also, along with that, the presumption that we know what the church needs, that
yeah.
we know what God needs, that we know what God should want to do right now. And I mean, I know, you know, we like to think we have good things to share, we have good things to give others, but who knows what God needs? And I think the root of that hope is a real faith that God will lead us where we need to go. And this may be down some strange zigzagging roads sometime that don't seem to be getting us anywhere, and yet to sort of just trust, that we're not the ones in charge and we're not the ones planning the journey. And this hope that God is planning the journey and will get us there where we need to go. I think it's absolutely essential.
This is taking us back. First of all, the third thing that the hopometer measures. What was that?
The third thing on the hopometer, let's go through them so we have a problem here. The first is relative to how quickly one acts. So that's sort of your diffidence rate. And then the scope, or the sort of expansiveness of what is contained within that which is particularly hoped for, and maybe to what depth. How, it's one thing to hope, like I said, for salvation. It's one thing to hope to experience God. It's another thing to perhaps to have an explicit account of God being hoped for as containing all in all, right? So there might be that sort of subjective sense of what is being hoped for. And then the third was the degree to which this is maybe sort of the opposite, or the correlate to the diffidence rate is sort of the adhesion rate. How virile is your adhesion? To the extent that I think the more it is, and again, this sort of quantified language is always dubious, but how difficult is it that you would be pried away from that which you are hoping? Since, at least for Bonaventure and many of his peers, what defines hope in patria, once it's been evacuated, and then it's tentio, grasping, is that you won't be moved. So how far have you come to that not being able to be moved? And so that would be number 3 on the Tanya hopometer. It's for sale, $99. It's this brilliant steal. It's going up to 200 next week.
Yeah.
Is it an app that you're on your smartwatch?
Give me a while, it will be.
Well, because you can actually measure your heart rate from that.
There we go. We can do that, and it'll let you.
You heard it here first, TM.
The other
Email the idea to me.
the other thing, and I'm sorry to drag us backwards, but just thinking about the phrase from Father Krause, our despair is all our own, reminded me of the Greek word idios, which we get and Dante is all alone, and this is so straightforward, but Dante's all alone at the beginning. And at the end, he is in the communion of all those who are gathered with the celestial rose, looking on the divine humanity, the union of divinity and humanity, the person of Christ, and looking on the Trinity. So it's a movement from, and plug for my favorite movie, The Fisher King. Jack starts out all by himself, and at the end, he is conducting a chorus of crazies in a mental hospital, and he is home and one with them all. He knows himself to belong, to all these people in all their craziness. It's a great movie.
It's a great movie.
Just return to the paper, I struck by, I was taught systematic theology by Jack Packer. I know he was in the room when this was delivered. It took a certain audacity to say to a room full of evangelicals that our faith must be renewed by a new attentiveness to God's word, as if they were already doing that. But I think of, I don't know, you who knew him, I don't know if he was conversant with Simone Weil, but the whole idea of a new vocabulary of attention is required, and I think this is what he's doing here. least that's my own connection. This is another practical
Yeah.
attention.
Well, the language of faith, hope, and charity, how much is that actually in play in our lives, you know, in our regular, you know, and I guess it's the question I have, because sometimes I take it for granted as, oh yeah, faith, hope, and charity, but to see them as in some way central to the Christian life, do we actually speak that way that much, really? And what does that say of us that we don't? I sort of thought it was maybe behind part of his exhortation is that they're not as central as they should be, even though it might assume they are.
Would there be a way in one's daily following of the prayer book to bring that into focus? Is that obvious? Those of you who are prayer book experts.
Well, it's one thing to have it on your shelf, another thing to actually pray it daily.
No, let's assume that we do.
Assume we do.
Let's assume
I think so.
We do morning and evening prayer. Are the 3 theological virtues woven into the language explicitly? Is there a way one can remember them? This is a genuine question. I'd love to take this moment to say, okay, I'm going to add fundamentum. I'm going to come back and make pursuit of the 3 theological virtues a part of my daily life.
I forget
My
this morning.
spiritual practice is really
Right.
prayer book now. I'm just wondering.
I forget this morning.
Surely it's wonderful and significant that we spend 6 months of the year being drawn into contemplation of the content of faith. And then, Trinity Sunday is kind of a cliff. Because the next day, we're reading St. James.
That's right. And Joe.
And St. Mark. And Job.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, George James, yeah.
Action and suffering.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and in the Eucharistic lectionary, St. John on charity.
Okay, yeah. And, yeah, the rich man and Lazarus, that's right.
Yeah.
Even if they won't hear Moses and the prophets, they won't hear even if one comes to them. And, which is pretty scary. But, yeah, faith, hope, and charity.
I suppose you could tie it to the 3 gospel canticles. Benedictus, the Magnificat, and Sancta Dimittis.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm sure they could go anywhere. I mean, they're full of all of them. But if you wanted to, you could probably, with the Canticle of Zechariah, just something sort of faith in the Magnificat, sort of the expression of Mary's wishes, and then the Nunc Dimittis maps pretty nicely onto charity.
So hope is the prayer of Zechariah.
Hope would be the Magnificat, casting down the mighty from the thumbs and all that.
Very
But certainly if you follow the old Eucharistic lectionary that's in the prayer book, and for instance, read Father Krause's commentaries or sermons on it, you see that, what's developed there, was developed in the patristic period, so that we could be immersed in these lessons and practices of growing in faith, hope, and charity, throughout the entire course of the church here. And so it isn't designed to be necessarily immediate. Well, we do that, and that Sunday you've got your dose of charity. But
Check.
check. But it's a life embracing and altering and transforming program, just like in the self-help section of the bookstore, but much older and much better, for the Christian to grow in faith, hope, and charity through a disciplined daily and weekly structured spiritual life. And the prayer book, the old prayer book Eucharistic lectionary is the, you know, the best thing that's left from that patristic period to anchor us in that. And it's a treasure like none other. And it actually can legitimately be traced back to the 5th and 6th centuries and pieces of it was earlier, and documentary proof. You know, like some people, some denominations may claim to go back earlier, but may not have the documentary proof for that. But we do have for the prayer book Eucharistic.
The three theological virtues. I haven't seen much commentary on this, but the first 3 Sundays of the Christian year, you know, the epistles, you know, owe no man anything but charity, and you know, the faith and comfort of the Holy Scriptures, which gives us hope, and being faithful ministers of the mysteries. That's setting the foundation for the whole Christian year in the lectionary.
And the sacraments themselves too are, of course, the means of this that are beyond our, well, I wonder if, how they relate to faith, hope, and charity, that they're beyond, certainly beyond our, the way they unite us is beyond our self-awareness.
It may be that I'm just not evil enough to fully understand and use my hopometer in the way that the instruction manual tells me to. But I am having some difficulty with the virile adhesion formulation of this. As awesome and cool as much as I would like to adhere to that, just thinking about the prayer book, I think, and in my experience of it, it's never worked out well for me when I have used it as a means of adhering in a virile way to a way of life. I found things to be, let's say, the dangers to be either ones of thinking that I could do it if I just worked hard enough, or on the other hand, sort of grasping, we just use grasping, and so, but the system, I think, as we just heard, is not one that's designed to give you a better tool for grasping things with, but to feed you. And it's the prayer book, I think, and the lectionaries, in the way that it arranges Scripture not just to be heard but to be prayed. It puts the words in your ears and in your mouth. It seems to be a way of humble reception. Not perfect, but a way in which the words of Scripture become our words, as much as, and to me there seems to be a distinction between, I don't know, that maybe that just
that's how I understand my own discomfort with the awesome virile adhesionometer, and might just not be the deal to grasp it. But I think yeah, at that.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking so much of that image in the poem that Patricia, that really striking poem that Patricia Robertson gave us yesterday at the whirlpool. So it's the whirlpool that sends you out into the estuary. So, but it's at the whirlpool that it's not your swimming anymore that takes over. Like it's actually, it's passive, right? That it's, and attention too is passive. It's essentially passive. So there is this weird, it's a real tension that I think it's hard to get underneath it between the passive and the active in thinking about this virtue.
I hate to disagree with you, but I think you're missing something really fundamental about that poem.
Okay.
Which is that it's the passive, one-faced ones who are looking at the perimeter.
Pardon me?
It's the purely passive, wan-faced, pale-faced, I can't remember the expression, that remain at the perimeter. It's the ones going to the center that then get sucked out and out into the estuary. That's the force of the world. There is an activity that requires you, hopefully and courageously, to dare
that's really
into the center.
So you read when he says, when she's the poet says, when the swimmer says, this is the whirlpool. So the swimmer says, the ones that don't say this is the whirlpool are the ones that remain at the perimeter.
They don't get it, that they gotta dive in, they gotta go into the danger zone, which will then send you out.
But to understand that it's the whirlpool is to understand that you need to swim into the perimeter.
That's not active. That's bloody courageous.
Oh no, I was
This is
reading
dangerous.
I was reading it as the ones who say, oh, you might be right, but shoot.
So there's no opposition between
Yeah.
Oh, I'm
Okay, I'll have to think about that. You might be right. That's a good reading.
Might be wrong.
I don't have a moment in front of me.
Well, maybe it's the acting that allows you ultimately to be passive.
Yeah,
right?
to be carried by grace, you have to. Yeah. But I mean, I was very struck by that language, and I was just wondering if wasn't a Dantean overtone to that, right? That the people who do neither do nothing, that that neither hot nor cold, who just despairingly are chasing the flag, to use the image from, right? They're like the ones in the. That language immediately evoked that image from the Divine Comedy for me, the folks who don't bother to even get into hell. It's like neither hot nor cold.
And I think maybe that helps with maybe a clarification of what the virile adhesion is that Bonaventure ends up speaking about at the end, because it's not a matter of the self-actualization, but I think sort of bringing oneself, just what you're talking about, sort of into that, let's say in the prayer book context, bringing yourself into that space in which you can be formed by these traditions of grace, to the point of being, you might say, in the light, which is overwhelming and strong and all these other sorts of things, when you might sort of simply stoop and sort of, it's almost sort of embracing the passivity is the act.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't like the poem. and this is a particular point. It seemed to me, sorry, I've got to hang up, and some of you in the room know it, I don't like 20th century stuff. And the first thing I do when I see a poem, I look at the dates of who wrote it. And so I said, okay, then. It's going to manifest, and this is unavoidable. I mean, Dante, he's called a medievalist for good reason, because he lived then. In a 20th century person, they may have some of the assumptions of that time frame. And so my hang up with it is that the individual initiates the action. They get to choose, they make the choice of entering into the whirlpool or not. And so there's no grace that moves the individual initially or works with the individual to move them in.
Unless
So
the grace
they
is
choose
the water
to go-
there already.
They choose to go in, they see the situation, they choose on their own initiative and agency, without any need for grace, to go into the whirlpool, and then to go out, and the ones who have the courage to do that, the human courage to do that, generate it by themselves, go in the whirlpool, and they get spit out into the estuary, and they're cool, and they're a lot better off. And those poor bland-faced, ones that didn't have the courage to do that, they're just back there roaming around with a bunch of zombies. So anyway, that was my interpretation.
But I think the point is that they're all going in the whirlpool.
Well, that's not how I read it, because then there's no courage in willingly entering into it.
Well,
It doesn't say, it doesn't suggest that there's this
Yes,
distinction.
there's a courage in confronting that this is the reality that's set before me, namely death, I think. And whereas the people swing around it, I mean, they don't have enough strength to keep that up for long, presumably. But they're not going to
things in it there now. Well, it depends how we interpret it, in terms of reference of all of it. That was my 2 cents. So I didn't see any grace in it at all. I didn't even see this Christian Paul. Sorry.
I'm just thinking
It
about
could be the party pooper.
sorry, adhesions, and of course, the prayer of adhesion in our baptism, which comes to mind. Renunciations, we all know, renounce the world, the flesh, the devil, and the adhesions are you turn to Jesus Christ and accept him as your Savior and Lord.
I don't wish to agree or disagree with anybody about Harvard but it was Father, or to test your patience. But the story, Father, you were the person who brought up the still small voice yesterday. The premier story that kicks around in my mind is that in 1 Kings 18 and 19, where Elijah has this amazing and courageous episode of standing up to, on his own, Ahab and Jezebel and the 450 prophets of Baal. And that's immediately followed by, kind of the most prominent episode of despair.
That's right.
That I can think of, where he flees south from now that we're acclimated to Israel, from the kind of nicer parts in the north, through the desert, back down into the Sinai wilderness, and says twice, before and after the still small voice, everybody in Israel is apostate. And they're killing the prophets with the sword, and only I am left. He says this after the still small voice, as well as before. And God's response to him is he's been fed before this and cared for in a certain way. But God says, go make so-and-so king of Syria and so king of Israel. And as a person called Elijah, who is going to replace you, tender your resignation. So there's a way in which he loses his vocation as a prophet in an episode of despair after one of the most, sort of incredible triumphs against idolatry in the world. I don't know what to say about that exactly, except it blows up the hopeometer in a little way, because God's word is moving in its own way. God's will not be thwarted, and there are still 7,000, and great Elijah has just lost his job.
Yeah. But the apostolic succession has been guaranteed.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
There's still apostolic succession. You can have your prayer break.
His ministry is handed on to another. I mean, what greater legacy of his success than to have it? But you're absolutely right.
It's a mind-boggling kind of episode of despair after what ought to feel like a triumph, but doesn't register that way to the prophet. Which undercuts adhesion. If it's a Jamesian kind of act, right? The act is God's somehow. That's the. Yeah.
Well, if we want to go full scholastic, I skipped over the whole treatment of unformed hope, which is what happens when you commit mortal sin. What happens to the virtue of hope? And one standard medieval account is, well, you're left with its traces that help you get back on the path. So that's certainly accounted for. because it still persists as an unformed virtue because it lacks charity in the medieval vocabulary. And faith can do the same thing, and that's what can help lead you back. Yeah. It's it's the Popometer redundancy bar.
Sure what time it is. Is it
10 after 3.
10 after 3?
After three.
Okay. Colin, how long? Just as long as we...
Kind of up to you all.
Up to all of us, okay. Does anyone have anything else to would burn in their hearts?
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
You're welcome. Thank you all.